Hey guys, so for this video we're going to be doing another gem introduction, if I can talk. Um, this time we're going to be taking a look at RSpec. It's used to essentially test developers' code, so it's good practice as a developer. Like anytime you write code, you have test coverage around that code. That way, if someone makes a change down the line and it breaks something, you know before you deploy that code out to where users will be hitting it. So we'll go ahead and get started here. We're going to do things a little differently. So I'm going to use my editor, which is VS Code. It's really easy to download if you want to do that. Also, Atom is another good editor, but we're just going to do things from that perspective. So we're going to open VS Code and then open a terminal. So this is essentially the exact same thing as this. It just makes it easier to be able to do the terminal and write code in the same window. So we're going to start by installing the gem. So it's gem install RSpec is the command. That shouldn't take long. There it is. And then once it's installed, we're going to run RSpec --init. And this will basically just give you the bare minimum you need to actually start working with RSpec. So you can see it created the spec folder with a spec helper. This includes your configuration around RSpec, but you don't have to change anything, especially for the sake of this video. And then it also gives you this, which requires a spec helper in. So we'll go ahead and just kind of make our first test file. And what we're going to do is we're going to write a method. We'll just call it +1, and basically it'll be a method that takes a number and adds 1 to it, and then returns the result. And then we'll write tests around that method and verify that it works as expected. So let's go ahead and make a new file. And all your tests are going to live in the spec directory. We'll call this one first _spec.rb. And the convention here is all your RSpec tests file names will have this _spec.rb at the end. So we'll create that. And now let's hop over to the documentation. So this is a really good guide. And there's a lot of information in here, so I will link this in the description. I would encourage you to check it out. But real quick call out, so the basic structure is you have this RSpec describe at the top of the file that all your tests are going to be wrapped in. And then within that, you can have nested describes, and these parameters can be class names, they can be strings, it just depends on your situation and how things are set up. And usually for nested describes, it'll be like the name of the method name is kind of the convention. And then within those describes, there can be either just an it block, which actually contains your test, or you can add another block in called a context block, which it's basically the same thing as a scribe block. It just adds more description to your test and makes it easier to navigate. So we'll go ahead and just kind of copy this first line just to make our lives easier here. But I said then instead of game, let's call it first spec. Another convention that you see sometimes is people if they're going to name it, they like to name it the same as the file name. And then before we get started on actually writing spec, let's write our method. So we're in a method called +1, takes an integer or a number, and then it takes the number and it's going to add 1 to it. So now using RSpec, let's write tests that assert this works correctly. So we'll start with another describe, like we saw in the example there. We'll call it, say, +1, just like the example. And then in here, let's add a context just so you can see them. And again, these behave the exact same way as far as RSpec is concerned. The only one that's really different is the top level one. So context uh, when it is called with 1, or we'll say 0. So when +1 is called with 0, it returns, so there's your it block, returns 1. So 0 + 1 is 1. Alright, so this is the actual test itself. The rest of it is kind of like navigation and placement of the test. But so what we want to do is we want to look at RSpec's documentation here. We can see RSpec gives us this expect method. It takes a parameter of what we expect, and then we expect it to equal something. So we're going to follow this exact same pattern. So expect +1 and we want to pass 0 into this because that's what we're doing for the test. And then we can say 2 equal 1. So now I think we're ready to run the test. So let's go ahead and do that. The way you do that is you do RSpec, and then the path that the test is located. So in our case, we're in this RSpec video, so it's in spec. So spec, and then we can tab completion there if we want, and it's called first spec. And if we run this, it should pass, so we can see it passed. So let's say, just to kind of illustrate the point test, so let's say someone a year from now comes in and changes this +1 method and makes it 2. And being the good developers we are, before we ship this change out to where users will be hitting it, we run our test, because usually that's kind of the process. So let's run our test again. You can see it failed, and it said expected 1 and got 2. So that should tell us, that would raise a red flag with us that, hey, something's wrong with this method. We maybe need to either revisit it and maybe we broke something, or maybe the test needs updated, but it keeps good visual, or keeps you safe, I guess. It covers your butt before you make changes in production and ship them out to the public. So that's one call out here. The other thing I want to call out real quick, so you can over test. Obviously, I'm not going to get too much into testing practices, but if you want to do like some additional methods here, you could say, we'll just copy a context. You can have several contexts nested within this overall describe. In this case, let's call it with, it doesn't matter, we'll say 10, and then it should equal 11. So we'll run that again. They should both pass, except I did something wrong. Oh wait, I forgot to update this back to 1. So we'll save that. Now if we run it, they should both pass. Cool. Another cool thing about tests is you can kind of like, there's different ways to test your code that you write, but another cool thing is like, let's say, what happens if someone passes a string into this? So we'll copy this context again. We'll say, when it is called with a string. And then this, obviously it's not going to equal 11, but let's see what happens. So we'll run all our tests here. Oh, it blew up. So you can see we got this error when it tried to add the number, which in this case is the string text to 1, says no implicit conversion of integer to string. That basically just means that, hey, Ruby can't add an integer and string together. But what you can do is, that's a good thing. Like, we expect that error to happen. So we could add a test around that and say, there's the syntax on this is a little different. So instead of having parentheses here, you would pass it in as a block, or in curly braces. Let's see. So the syntax for that is the curly braces with the +1 test. And then instead of 2 equal, we want to say raise error. And then we pass in the error type. So in this case, it's going to be this type error without the colon. So now if we run it, also I forgot to update the verbiage here. ADD, and I apologize. We'll make that 11. And we should say it raises error here. Now if we run it, they should all 3 pass. Cool. So now let's say if for some reason passing in a string here didn't raise an error, it would now, or the test would break because it didn't raise an error. So yeah, this is just a brief introduction to RSpec. Obviously this method itself, you don't normally write something like this, but it served our purpose as far as writing tests around it. So in the future I'll be doing more stuff with RSpec, but I think this is a good stopping place. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe. Appreciate it. See you guys.